Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take complex source material, break it down, and pull out the insights you need.
And today, we're looking at the modern UK.
Yeah, a nation that's really been through the ringer recently, hasn't it? You had the whole Brexit saga.
Followed almost immediately by the global COVID crisis, a massive double hit.
Exactly. And that combination, that's really the key here, isn't it?
It is,
Yeah,
because it forces you to look past just, individual policy mistakes or bad luck.
right.
The sources we're diving into today, it's a detailed, quite critical analysis from Chinese academics. They don't see Brexit and the pandemic response as separate things.
Okay, how do they frame it then?
They see them as symptoms, really serious symptoms of deeper structural problems within the UK system itself.
Structural problems. Like what?
Well, the core idea, the thesis we're unpacking, is what they term institutional arrogance. And they argue this leads to a kind of systemic decline.
Institutional arrogance. Okay, that's a strong phrase.
Yeah.
So where do we start unpacking that? With Brexit, I suppose.
Makes sense. That's where the initial political earthquake really happened.
And the sources, they don't pull punches here. They actually quote that American columnist Thomas Friedman.
Oh, yeah, the quote about economic suicide.
That's the one. Watching a nation basically deciding to commit economic suicide, but unable to even agree on how to do it. Bleak.
It sets the tone. And the sources label Brexit right away as a disruptive mistake.
Disruptive because
Because it was always going to cause long-term economic instability. I mean, you're leaving free access to this huge EU single market that's bound to hurt.
Why did it happen? What was the trigger, according to these sources?
Well, what's interesting is how they trace back the populist fuel for that leave vote.
Okay.
They argue it connects directly to the EU's expansion back after 2004, when several Central and Eastern European countries joined.
Right, I remember that. It led to quite high immigration into the UK.
Exactly. And the sources say this influx fed a political narrative pushed hard by populist figures.
Saying that immigrants were stealing the rice bowls. I think I remember that phrase being used.
Precisely. That was the line. And whether those worries were, fully justified economically or just politically useful.
Doesn't really matter in the end.
Right. The result was that all sorts of social issues, crime, general unease, it all got blamed on these incoming workers.
Which built the momentum for the leave vote.
Yeah. But as you said, this crisis didn't happen in isolation. It crashed right into the COVID pandemic.
Double whammy.
That's what they call it. And the sources even mention the panic buying toilet paper, canned goods, all that.
That started even before the UK officially left in January 2020.
Yeah, apparently driven by fears about what Brexit would do to prices of EU goods.
And boom, early 2020, COVID hits. Talk about timing.
Terrible timing. And this is where the sources get really critical of the UK's initial response to the pandemic.
What was their main criticism?
They point to the government initially sort of flirting with this idea of herd immunity.
Yes. That was controversial.
Very. And the sources claim it basically showed a willingness to prioritize commercial interests, the economy.
Over human life.
That's the argument they make.
Yes.
And the outcome.
Catastrophic, according to this analysis. The UK ended up as one of Europe's worst-hit countries.
Even the Prime Minister ended up in hospital, didn't he?
He did, which forced a major U-turn towards stricter measures eventually. But the damage was done.
And the sources saw the policy as inconsistent?
Wildly inconsistent. They used the phrase flipping like a pancake, which they argued just prolonged the agony, leading to more severe outbreaks later on.
Wow. Okay, so to really emphasize this failure, the sources use a specific comparison, right?
They do, and it's
Right.
pretty stark. They compare the UK's population, about 67 million people,
Okay.
to China's Hunan province, which is roughly the same number of people.
Right, similar scale. So what are the numbers?
Well, by November of the year they analyzed, the UK had racked up 9.36 million confirmed COVID cases.
9.36 million.
Okay.
And Hunan?
1,197. Sorry, say that again.
11,197 cases in Hunan, compared to over 9 million in the UK.
That's an incredible difference. What about deaths?
Even more jarring, UK, 142,000 cumulative deaths.
And Hunan province.
Just 4 deaths, according to the sources.
4 versus 142,000, with similar populations.
Yeah. And the sources use this exact comparison to make a point. They say it completely undermines earlier narratives in some Western media.
Like what?
They specifically call out The Economist's headline, "One virus, 2 systems."
Implying the Western democratic system was inherently better at handling it.
That was the implication, yeah. And these academics argue the raw numbers, the reality on the ground, just didn't support that.
So for them, this huge difference isn't just about policy choices. It's evidence of that institutional arrogance you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. The arrogance wasn't just in making mistakes. It was in the underlying assumption that their system was fundamentally superior and wouldn't fail so badly.
Which leads to the question, why did it fail so badly if the stakes were so high?
And that brings us right back to the core of their argument, those deeper institutional problems.
Right.
They shift from institutional arrogance to something they call institutional stupidity.
Stupidity.
That sounds harsh.
It means a systemic inability to adapt, to learn from facts on the ground. And they root this in three main areas of crisis.
Right, let's break those down. What's the first one?
Leadership. The sources see current leaders as, well, disconnected.
Disconnected how?
They argue the UK's stuck in what they call game democracy.
Game democracy.
Yeah, where elections become less about governing and more about political marketing. It's about performance.
So it produces leaders who are good at campaigning, maybe.
Exactly. Clever demagogues, they call them. Great at winning votes, but maybe not the kind of statesman needed for, deep long-term change.
Because they're focused on the next election cycle.
Precisely. Which leads straight into the second problem, systemic short-sightedness.
The argument is that political parties have become partial interest parties. They're laser focused on short-term wins, on keeping their voter base happy now.
And ignoring the bigger picture, the country's overall long-term health.
That's the claim. They even quote Louis XV of France.
Oh, the après moi le déluge line. After me, the flood.
That's the one. Basically, kick the can down the road, worry about immediate political survival, let the future deal with the consequences.
Which obviously makes it hard to tackle big, necessary reforms.
Which is the third issue, resistance to reform.
Because any major change is going to upset someone.
Exactly. The system, run by these short-sighted partial interest parties, finds it incredibly difficult to push through anything significant because you always have entrenched groups fighting to keep the status quo.
And this failure, this short-sightedness, it had immediate consequences after Brexit, didn't it?
Absolutely. Look at the supply chain crisis.
Right. The fuel shortages, empty shelves.
The irony there is pretty stark. Brexit was sold partly on securing British jobs, right? Taking back control. But by cutting off easy access to EU labor, suddenly the UK had this massive shortage of workers.
Especially truck drivers. I remember that being huge news.
Critical shortage. And low-skilled labor generally. Which directly caused all that port congestion, the fuel queues.
And costs went through the roof.
Dramatically. Container shipping, usually maybe $2,000, $3,000. It peaked at over $20,000.
$20,000 for a container. Wow. That's a perfect example of short-term thinking leading to immediate pain.
It really is. A structural breakdown caused by ignoring the practical realities.
Now, the sources also talk about a deeper cultural element here, don't they? Something underpinning these institutional issues.
They do. They point to Western culture, specifically Anglo-American culture, and its strong emphasis on self-interest.
How does that play in?
They describe the individual almost as a self-interest animal. And they argue this intense focus on the individual makes it really hard to build a cohesive, social, organic whole.
Meaning, it's hard to get everyone pulling in the same direction for the common good.
That seems to be the implication. If the default is always what's in it for me, collective action becomes difficult.
And you could see that during the pandemic, right? The fights over masks, for example.
Exactly. If a society struggles to agree on basic collective safety measures because individual liberty is seen as paramount over any social responsibility,
then tackling bigger challenges that need shared sacrifice and long-term planning becomes incredibly tough.
That's the argument. The cultural foundation itself might be working against the kind of unity needed to face these huge 21st century problems.
Okay, so if the internal picture is one of fragmentation, short-sightedness, maybe even cultural obstacles.
Yeah.
What does that mean for the UK's big external plan, this global Britain idea?
Yeah, that post-Brexit strategy aiming for renewed global influence, stronger trade ties.
How do the sources see that playing out?
With a fair bit of skepticism, frankly. They point to problems even in the UK's most solid relationship, the one with the US.
The special relationship. What's the issue there?
Well, while the UK still aligns very closely with the US, they even let Amazon Web Services, AWS, handle their intelligence data infrastructure.
Wow, really?
Yeah, but at the same time, the sources note the U.S. itself is seen by many as being in decline. And more pointedly, remember the Afghanistan withdrawal.
Yeah, the chaotic exit.
The U.S. didn't even properly consult the U.K., apparently, despite Britain losing nearly 500 soldiers over the years there.
So special seems a bit one-sided.
It looks strained, certainly.
And what about Europe? How are things with the EU post-Brexit?
Still really difficult. The sources say relations are at a historic low. You've got ongoing fights over fishing rights, the whole Northern Ireland Protocol issue.
Ah, yes, the protocol.
Yeah.
Just to remind everyone, that's the complex setup to avoid a hard border in Ireland, which creates trade checks between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, still causing headaches.
Major headaches.
Yeah.
And the current PMs talk about building a patriots economy separate from Europe.
The sources don't buy that.
They see it as pure populism. It goes against the UK's entire history as a trading nation, a commercial statehood, built on global free trade. It's like political messaging trumping economic sense again.
And is there an example where this lack of strategic clarity really stands out?
China policy, according to these sources, they see it as a prime example of strategic confusion.
How so?
The big one is the Huawei 5G decision.
Right. The UK was initially going to use them, then ban them.
Exactly. Fully supportive at first, then a complete U-turn, very clearly under pressure from the U.S.
And the sources take on that.
That it cost the UK a fortune, undermined its own commercial principles, especially since they never actually showed any legal proof of wrongdoing by Huawei.
So the perception is,
Yeah.
what, lack of independence?
Yeah, a lack of strategic autonomy.
Right.
And inability to stick to a consistent policy when leaned on by a bigger ally.
Okay, this leads to the final point the sources make about military posture, which they link back to that institutional arrogance.
Right. They highlight the big deployment of the HMS Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier group to the South China Sea.
That was positioned as aligning with U.S. strategy in the region, wasn't it?
Explicitly so. But the story of that deployment is, well, telling.
What happened?
Before it even got to the South China Sea, the group had that run-in with Russian jets firing warning shots near Crimea.
I remember that.
And then during the deployment itself, they had a major COVID outbreak on board, over 100 cases apparently.
Not ideal for projecting power.
Hardly. But they pressed on, and when they finally reached the South China Sea,
What was the reception?
China's military, the PLA, ran targeted exercises and basically declared a restricted zone.
So confrontation.
Not quite. The sources quote a British admiral admitting that Chinese warships shadowed the fleet constantly, like a shadow. In the end, the carrier group had to take a less controversial, more roundabout route.
So the message the sources draw from this.
Historical ignorance. They compare it to the 1949 incident with HMS Amethyst, a British ship shelled on the Yangtze River, which really marked the end of Western gunboat diplomacy in China.
So they're saying the UK hasn't learned that lesson, that showing up with a carrier group doesn't carry the same weight anymore.
That's the core message, that the assumption you can just patrol unchallenged, that kind of institutional arrogance, is totally out of sync with today's geopolitical reality.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. The core finding from this pretty critical analysis seems to be
that from the supply chain mess, the pandemic failures, right through to these geopolitical stumbles.
It's not just isolated incidents or bad luck.
No. The sources see the UK in a steep decline, and they argue it's rooted in these deep systemic problems, that pervasive institutional arrogance and short-sightedness we've talked about.
A steep decline rooted in the system itself. So what's the way out, according to these academics? Is there one?
Their prescription is pretty demanding. They say the UK needs to embrace emancipating thought and seeking truth from facts. Basically, a radical shift away from the populist short-term thinking, facing reality however uncomfortable.
But that's the catch-22, isn't it?
Exactly. The challenge is huge because the very system, with its focus on short-term political wins, actively prevents those kinds of radical, maybe painful, reforms needed to actually compete effectively in the long run.
It's a really sobering picture of a major nation trying to navigate some incredibly turbulent waters.
It is. And the underlying critique seems to be that a society built so heavily on individual self-interest really struggles when faced with crises that demand collective action, shared sacrifice, and looking beyond the immediate future.
Which leaves us, and you, with a final thought to consider. If this critique of institutional arrogance and short-sightedness has merit, does the future survival and success of any political system when faced with these massive global challenges ultimately depend on its ability to find a better balance? A balance between individual liberty and immediate self-interest on one hand and the long-term collective good on the other. Something to think about. Thanks for diving deep with us.